Most people fear silence. When it arrives, it feels like something has gone wrong, as if we've been exiled from the celebration of life. But Carl Jung invites us to see this differently. Solitude, he suggests, is not a mistake. It is a calling, a quiet summons from the depths of the unconscious, often disguised as loss, disconnection, or a sudden fading of what once brought joy. We rarely recognize it for what it is, because it doesn't announce itself with clarity. It arrives wrapped in confusion, boredom, or grief. But this silence is not empty. It is full of purpose. Jung believed that the psyche has its own seasons, and solitude is the winter of the soul. Cold, still, but fertile beneath the surface. Just as nature retreats before it blooms again, we are sometimes pulled inward to regenerate the parts of ourselves we've neglected. It's during these quiet exiles from the world that the ego loosens its grip, and something older, deeper, more truthful begins to stir. The world might see your isolation as a failure, a detour. But in Jungian terms, this retreat marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beyond masks, roles, and expectations. If you feel like life has silenced you, perhaps you're not being abandoned, but prepared. There is a reason you're alone right now, and that reason might be the most important revelation of your life. In the symbolic language of Carl Jung, solitude is not simply an emotional state. It is an archetype. One of the most ancient and universal images embedded in the collective unconscious is that of the hermit. He appears across cultures: the desert monk, the forest sage, the mountain ascetic. His presence is not accidental. The hermit represents the part of the human psyche that withdraws not out of weakness, but out of necessity, to seek truth in silence and to touch the sacred in stillness. In Jungian thought, this archetype emerges in our lives not by choice, but by need. When the outer world loses its meaning, the inner world begins to speak, but it only speaks in silence. The modern world has no patience for the hermit. In a culture that rewards noise, speed, and visibility, solitude is mistaken for failure. We're taught to always be doing, achieving, posting, connecting. To withdraw is to disappear. But Jung teaches us that what looks like disappearance on the surface is often an initiation happening within. The hermit archetype doesn't seek validation, it seeks depth, and solitude is its sanctuary. To embody the hermit archetype is to enter a sacred space where the ego cannot follow. It is a confrontation with the unconscious, a place where we meet our shadows, our unhealed wounds, our forgotten dreams. Jung referred to this process as the individuation journey, the gradual unfolding of the self, where the fragmented pieces of who we are begin to cohere into something whole. This is not a passive act. It is a kind of psychic pilgrimage. And solitude is the path that leads us there. Many people resist this process because they misunderstand what solitude truly offers. They see only the absence of friends, of plans, of attention. But absence is the doorway. Behind it is presence, a deeper presence with the self. In Jungian terms, the hermit's lantern doesn't light the path ahead. It illuminates what is already inside you. Every hour spent in solitude is a descent into the inner cave, where clarity slowly replaces confusion, and where you begin to recognize that your longing for the world was, in part, a longing to escape yourself. But the hermit doesn't remain isolated forever. In myths and stories, the hermit always returns. He re-enters the world with gifts, insight, wisdom, healing, and so too will you. Jung reminds us that solitude is not an end, but a transformation chamber. You are not being left behind. You are being reshaped. To resist this archetypal calling is to resist your own evolution. Solitude is the forge of the soul, and while it may burn, it also purifies. The question is not, why am I alone? The real question is, what am I being called to uncover in this aloneness? The hermit archetype asks us to stop seeing solitude as a space of lack and to start seeing it as sacred. You are not broken because you are alone. You are being refined. And in that refinement lies the secret Jung pointed toward again and again. The self is not something we find in the world. but something we uncover within, in the quiet places we've been taught to fear. To truly understand why solitude is not only meaningful but necessary, we must enter one of the most powerful and often misunderstood aspects of Jungian psychology, the shadow. Jung defined the shadow as the part of the unconscious that contains all that we reject, deny, or disown in ourselves. Our fears, our repressed desires, our rage, our shame, all the qualities we hide from the world, and even from our own conscious awareness. In the noise and distraction of daily life, we can avoid the shadow. But in solitude, it waits for us. And if we are brave enough to look, it begins to speak. Solitude removes the distractions that keep the ego intact. Without the constant mirrors of others to reinforce our identities, who we are in a relationship, in a job, in a social setting, we are left with the raw material of the self. This is where shadow work begins. Alone, we are forced to face the parts of ourselves that we've long buried. And though this confrontation is painful, it is also the doorway to real psychological transformation. Jung was clear. No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To sit in solitude is to create the conditions for this unveiling. In the beginning, it may feel like suffering. You may encounter anxiety, restlessness, even despair. These are the first signals that the unconscious is stirring, that the ego's illusions are beginning to dissolve. Jung saw this discomfort not as pathology, but as initiation. The psyche, he believed, contains a natural tendency toward wholeness, and the emergence of the shadow is not a breakdown, it is the beginning of reintegration. But this process requires courage. It is not a romantic solitude of candles and books. It is the raw exposure of one's inner fragmentation. Shadow work asks you to see yourself not as you wish to be, but as you truly are. In all your contradictions, all your darkness. The solitude that facilitates this is not passive. It is active engagement with your deepest inner terrain. This is why so many avoid being alone. Because to be alone, truly alone, is to meet the version of yourself that no one else knows. And once you meet it, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. Yet there is immense power in this encounter. When we integrate our shadow, not repress it, not run from it, but face it, we recover lost energy. Jung believed that much of our psychological suffering comes from this repression. Hidden in your shadow is not just pain, but potential. The anger you suppress might contain your lost assertiveness. The fear you bury might guard your forgotten courage. The grief you ignore might be holding the key to your empathy. By entering solitude and facing the shadow, you are not diminishing yourself. You are reclaiming your wholeness. This is why Jung spoke of solitude with such reverence. It is not merely the absence of others. It is the presence of the inner world. And in that presence, the deepest transformation becomes possible. Shadow work is not a side journey. It is the heart of the path, and solitude is the only place it can truly unfold. What begins as discomfort evolves into integration. The fragments begin to fit. You start to see that the darkness within you is not something to be erased, but something to be understood, accepted, and ultimately transformed. This is the alchemy of solitude. It takes what you fear most and turns it into your greatest source of strength. You don't emerge from this process the same, and that is precisely the point. You are not meant to be who you were. You are meant to become who you are. Carl Jung didn't view solitude as a mistake in the fabric of our lives, but as a necessary state that protects a sacred process, the slow, often painful but deeply transformative journey of individuation. In modern language, individuation might be mistaken for self-improvement or finding your purpose, but in Jungian terms, it is something far deeper. The integration of all the fragmented parts of the psyche into a cohesive, authentic whole. And this doesn't happen in the light of the crowd. It happens in the darkness of aloneness. Individuation begins the moment you realize that the identity you've been performing no longer fits. The roles you've worn, the achiever, the caregiver, the rebel, the good one, start to feel like costumes that restrict your breath. Life, in its strange wisdom, begins to dismantle the external structures that once defined you. Friends grow distant, work loses its meaning, old pleasures no longer satisfy, and before you realize what's happening, you find yourself alone, not by choice, but by necessity. This is not abandonment. This is architecture. The soul is making space for something new. In Jungian psychology, individuation is less about becoming something and more about uncovering what was always there, hidden beneath adaptation, trauma, conditioning. And this uncovering cannot happen while the ego is still clinging to external affirmation. That's why solitude is not a punishment. It's protection. It places you in a psychological cocoon, a space where the voice of the self, the true center of your being, can finally be heard without distortion. But this kind of solitude is not quiet. It speaks in paradoxes. You feel both empty and full, lost and found, detached from the world, yet more intimately connected to life than ever before. Jung understood this tension. The path of individuation often brings with it a feeling of exile, a sense that you no longer belong where you once did. But you don't yet know where you're going. It's a liminal space. You're not who you were, and not yet who you will be. And in that in-between, solitude becomes the crucible where transformation takes shape. This process is rarely linear. There are regressions, doubts, moments of despair. But solitude doesn't just make these moments possible. It makes them sacred. Without the distraction of external performance, you begin to notice the subtler movements within you. Your dreams speak more vividly. Your emotions become sharper tools. The archetypes, the inner king, warrior, lover, child, begin to surface, each one offering a piece of the self you're called to embody. This is the work of becoming. Not fixing yourself, not perfecting yourself, but integrating yourself. Jung warned that the greatest danger in modern life was not madness, but superficiality, the avoidance of depth, the refusal to go inward. In solitude, this avoidance is no longer possible. You begin to live from a different center, not the ego, but the self. The self is not just your personality. It is the totality of who you are, including what has been forgotten, denied, or repressed. To live from the self is to live authentically, not according to social scripts, but from an inner knowing that cannot be taught, only uncovered. And here's the paradox Jung so often pointed to. Only by being utterly alone do we realize we are not alone at all. When you connect with the self, you connect with the archetypal forces that move through all human beings. Your solitude becomes a mirror of the collective. And in healing yourself, you begin to heal your relationship with the world. You return not as the same person, but as someone more whole, more rooted, more real. So if life has pulled you into isolation, don't rush to escape it. Sit with it. Listen. What feels like disconnection might be the most sacred connection of your life, the one between you and your truest self. In the end, individuation is not a solo journey. It is simply one that begins in solitude. There comes a moment in solitude that is less about silence and more about collapse. The quiet implosion of everything we thought we were. Jung understood this deeply. He believed that much of human suffering originates not from the truth of who we are, but from the lie we feel compelled to maintain. This lie is what he referred to as the persona, the mask we wear in public, shaped by cultural expectations, social roles, and the deep, unconscious desire to be accepted. In solitude, that mask begins to crack, and for the first time, you're faced with a terrifying but liberating realization. The person you've spent so long trying to be is not who you truly are. The false self is adaptive. It helps us survive, navigate society, build relationships. But it is also limiting. Like a suit of armor that protects us in battle, it eventually becomes too heavy to carry. And in solitude, when there's no one left to perform for, when the echo of applause fades, that armor begins to feel less like protection and more like confinement. Jung saw this not as a breakdown, but as a breakthrough. When the mask no longer fits, the self begins to breathe. This unraveling of the false self is rarely graceful. It may come as a quiet dread, a sense of hollowness, or an identity crisis that tears through your daily routine. You may start to question your ambitions, your values, even your relationships. Everything feels unstable. But instability, in Jungian terms, is the precondition for growth. When the structures of the ego fall away, the psyche opens to deeper truths. It is in this empty space, frightening, vast, and unfamiliar, that the authentic self begins to emerge. Solitude is the only container spacious enough for this death and rebirth process. Surrounded by noise, we cling to familiar scripts. But alone, we are stripped of roles. We are no longer the caretaker, the success story, the people pleaser, the rebel. We are simply here, raw, vulnerable, undefined. And that is where real healing happens. Because the self does not emerge through performance, it emerges through presence. Not who you try to be, but who you are when there's nothing left to try. This dissolution can feel like grief. And it is. You are mourning the self that never truly existed, the self that was shaped by fear, by trauma, by unconscious obedience to a world that never knew you. But in that mourning, you make space for something sacred. Jung often spoke of this phase as a kind of symbolic death. The ego dies so that the self may be born, and like any death, it is painful, but also necessary. In the myths that Jung studied, this process appears again and again. The hero descends into the underworld, shedding their former identity, facing monsters, which are often reflections of themselves, and returning not as who they were, but as who they were meant to become. Your solitude is your underworld, and the false self is the monster you must face. But it is not your enemy. It was simply trying to protect you. What matters now is the choice to release it. The world is full of people who are never alone, and yet deeply lost. They've traded their authenticity for acceptance, their truth for belonging. But in solitude, when you finally take off the mask, you reclaim something far more precious than approval. You reclaim your soul. Jung believed that the self holds a wisdom far greater than the ego can comprehend, and that wisdom only reveals itself in the space where the old self has been surrendered. So if you find yourself in a place where nothing fits anymore, where your identity feels hollow, your roles feel performative, your desires feel foreign, don't panic. You are not falling apart, you are falling inward. And the self that emerges from this inner collapse will not need applause to exist. It will simply be whole, aware, alive. Solitude, then, is not loneliness. It is initiation. The false self must die so that the true self can live. And though the process may feel like loss, what you're truly losing is illusion. What you're gaining is freedom. In our world of constant noise and distraction, silence is often feared. It feels like a void, a vacuum that threatens to swallow us whole. Our devices ping for attention. Our thoughts race endlessly, and social interactions are often more about filling the space than truly connecting. But in solitude, silence is not an enemy. It is a teacher. Carl Jung understood this well. Silence is the medium through which the unconscious speaks most clearly. It is the fertile soil in which the seeds of transformation take root. The first thing you notice in true silence is the overwhelming sense of discomfort. It's as if your inner world, once drowned out by the noise of daily life, suddenly demands attention. The mind that was once busy is now forced to confront the stillness. And this stillness can be unsettling. Without the constant distractions of the outside world, you are left with nothing but your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own fears. In a world that pushes us to constantly do, silence becomes the great unknown. But paradoxically, it is within this silence that the soul begins to find its voice. Jung spoke of the importance of listening to the unconscious. He believed that the unconscious speaks to us through symbols, dreams, and emotions, but in a language that is often misunderstood by the rational waking mind. In solitude, free from the noise of external influences, we can finally begin to hear this language. It is in silence that the unconscious reveals itself, not as a distant and obscure force, but as a vital part of who we are. Our forgotten desires, our unexpressed grief, our hidden talents, all emerge from the depths, demanding to be seen and integrated. The silence of solitude is not empty. It is rich with meaning, thick with layers of emotional and psychological truth. Just as a seed needs the quiet darkness of the soil to sprout, so too does the psyche require silence to reveal its hidden treasures. Jung believed that our modern world was in danger of losing touch with the unconscious, overwhelmed by the constant hum of technology, media, and social interaction. This loss, he warned, would lead to a deep sense of alienation and disconnection from the self. The antidote, he argued, was not more noise or more busyness, but a return to the silence within. In silence, we reconnect with our deepest essence, the part of us that is timeless and whole. The voice of the soul is subtle, and it requires the spaciousness of silence to be heard clearly. It does not shout like the demands of the ego or the expectations of society. It speaks in whispers, in symbols, in moments of sudden insight. Silence allows us to listen more deeply, to attune ourselves to the quiet, ever-present wisdom that resides within. When we create space for silence in our lives, we create space for our true selves to emerge, without judgment, without performance, without fear. Yet silence, in its rawest form, can be terrifying. It confronts us with our own vulnerability, our own mortality, and the aspects of ourselves we've long suppressed. In silence, we can no longer avoid the truth. But rather than being a threat, this confrontation is an invitation. It is a call to wake up from the trance of distraction and to begin the process of conscious living. The quiet voice within is the voice of your truest self. The self that is not bound by time, by expectations, or by the masks you've worn for others. Jung often emphasized the importance of dreams in this process. Dreams, like silence, are a gateway to the unconscious, a place where the soul can speak freely. But to truly hear the message, one must be willing to listen without judgment, without the need to control or shape the experience. The same is true for the silence of solitude. It requires a willingness to let go of the need for answers, for productivity, for action. In the silence, you are not expected to do anything. You are simply invited to be. And in that being, something miraculous happens. The soul finds its voice. It may not speak in words. It may speak in emotions, in visions, in sudden realizations, but it speaks, and it speaks the truth of who you are. Beyond the layers of conditioning, beyond the roles you play, beyond the illusions of your everyday life, the silence of solitude becomes the mirror in which you see yourself clearly for the first time. This is the transformative power of silence. It strips away the noise, the chaos, and the confusion, leaving only the pure essence of your being. And in that clarity, you begin to understand the deeper currents of your life. You begin to understand the meaning behind your fears, your desires, and your dreams. You begin to see the path that has always been there, waiting for you to follow it. But this transformation requires courage. It requires the courage to face the silence, to sit in the discomfort, to embrace the unknown. It requires the courage to listen to the voice of the soul, even when that voice challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. And yet, in that courage, there is freedom. The freedom to live authentically, to follow the call of your own inner wisdom, and to reclaim the life that is waiting for you. Solitude and silence are not enemies. They are the very conditions in which the soul awakens, finds its voice, and begins to speak the truth. The more we allow ourselves to be still, to listen, and to embrace the silence, the more we come to understand the deep, transformative power of our own being. In that silence, we find everything we have been searching for. Not in the world, but within ourselves. Solitude is often misunderstood as mere isolation or loneliness, a void to be feared and avoided at all costs. But in the language of Carl Jung, solitude is not a curse. It is an archetypal journey, a return to the sacred space where we can reconnect with the deepest parts of our being. The archetypes that shape our lives, according to Jung, are universal patterns of human experience, and they are often most vividly activated in moments of solitude. These archetypes are not simply psychological constructs. They are primordial forces that reside in the collective unconscious, guiding us toward our ultimate self-realization. To understand solitude in this deeper way, we must first understand that it is not a state of emptiness, but one of rich potential. Just as ancient heroes in myths and legends must venture into the wilderness or the underworld to undergo transformation, so too must we face the silence of solitude to confront the forces within us that shape our lives. The journey into solitude is not one of abandonment, but of initiation. It is a sacred rite of passage, in which the self is tested, broken open, and ultimately reborn. In many of the great mythological stories, from the hero's journey to the trials of the divine, we see the theme of solitary encounters with the unconscious. Jung believed that the soul's journey toward wholeness involves a confrontation with what he called the shadow, the repressed, denied, and often darker aspects of the psyche. In solitude, these shadow elements can no longer be avoided. They come to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. This confrontation is uncomfortable, even terrifying, but it is also necessary for growth. The archetype of the hero is central to the process of individuation. The hero embarks on a journey to face challenges, overcome fears, and ultimately return transformed. Similarly, when we enter solitude, we embark on a journey of our own. It is a journey of self-discovery, of meeting the parts of ourselves we have long ignored, rejected, or feared. The hero's journey in solitude is not about escaping the world, but about returning to a truer, deeper relationship with it. The solitude of the soul's journey is a journey of integration, not only of the parts of ourselves we like, but also of those we would rather deny. In solitude, the archetypes that reside within us, the warrior, the lover, the king, the magician, begin to come into sharper focus. These are the inner figures that, when properly integrated, guide us toward wholeness. But first, they must be awakened. The warrior within us represents strength, courage, and the will to fight for what is right. The lover connects us to the deeper currents of emotion, intimacy, and passion. The king embodies our capacity for leadership, wisdom, and a sense of higher purpose. The magician symbolizes the transformative power of the unconscious, guiding us to see the hidden potential within ourselves. When we are caught up in the busyness of life, these archetypes often remain dormant, overshadowed by the demands of daily existence. But in solitude, there is space for them to emerge. When we are alone, the noise of external pressures fades, and we begin to hear the inner call of these archetypes, urging us to embody their wisdom. The warrior may ask us to confront our deepest fears. The lover may invite us to open our hearts and explore the depths of our desires. The king may call us to stand in our power and lead with integrity. The magician may guide us to transform our pain into wisdom, to see the world through a lens of possibility. The return to solitude is, in this sense, a return to the sacred. Jung believed that the process of individuation was not just a psychological journey, it was a spiritual one. It is a journey that reconnects us to the divine, to the archetypal forces that govern our lives. Solitude, therefore, becomes a space where we encounter not only our own unconscious, but the greater mysteries of existence. It is in solitude that we can access the wisdom of the ages, the eternal truths that reside within all of us. Jung often spoke of the need for a return to the self, a reclamation of the parts of us that have been lost or repressed. This return is not just a psychological or emotional one, it is a spiritual return. Solitude, in this sense, is the pilgrimage that leads us back to the center of our being. It is the sacred journey that allows us to reconnect with the divine presence within us, the spark of the numinous that resides in the depths of the soul. This sacred return is a journey of healing, wholeness, and transformation. The sacredness of solitude is not always apparent in the beginning. At first, it may seem like a place of emptiness, even despair. But as the journey unfolds, we realize that solitude is not a void, it is a vessel, a container for transformation. It is where the soul can be stripped of its illusions and returned to its purest form. It is where we can meet the archetypes that shape our lives, listen to their guidance, and begin to embody their wisdom. Ultimately, solitude is not about retreating from the world. It is about returning to it with a new sense of clarity, purpose, and depth. Just as the hero's journey involves a return to the world, so too does our journey through solitude. But this return is different. It is not the same self that leaves the world and returns. It is a self that has been transformed, renewed, and awakened. And as we re-enter the world, we do so with a deeper sense of authenticity, with a greater connection to the archetypal forces that guide our lives, and with the wisdom that only solitude can bring. Solitude, in its deepest form, does not simply isolate us. It serves as the crucible in which the self is tested, purified, and ultimately reborn. Just as the phoenix rises from its ashes, the soul that undergoes the transformative journey of solitude emerges anew. Not as a new identity to be worn as a mask, but as a deeper, truer version of itself. This rebirth is not a mere change of appearance, but a profound shift in consciousness, an awakening to the deeper dimensions of our being. In the process of solitude, the false self, that collection of personas, roles, and masks we wear to navigate the world, begins to break down. What emerges is the self, not as an ego-driven construct, but as the purest expression of who we are, free from the expectations and constraints imposed by society. It is as if the layers of the psyche, each representing a different aspect of our existence, begin to peel away, leaving behind only the essence of who we are at the core. Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey toward the realization of the self, which is never fully separate from the collective unconscious, but is also uniquely ours. Individuation is the journey of integration, where the various facets of our unconscious, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the archetypes, are reconciled and brought into harmony. Solitude offers the space to confront these parts of ourselves, to meet them with courage, and to allow them to come into the light. Without the distractions of external life, we are able to turn inward and face these hidden aspects of our psyche, our fears, our desires, our unresolved conflicts. As we do so, we begin to reclaim the fragmented parts of ourselves that we once denied or ignored. This reclamation is not an easy process. It requires us to confront the very things we have buried deep within, the aspects of ourselves that we have deemed unworthy or unacceptable. It is in solitude, in the absence of the judgment of others, that we can safely encounter these parts of ourselves. The confrontation with the shadow, the unacknowledged and repressed aspects of the psyche, is a necessary step on the path to wholeness. But it is also a liberating one. For only by embracing these darker parts of ourselves can we truly experience the light that is found within. The process of rebirth is not an instantaneous transformation. It is gradual, unfolding over time, as the self integrates the lessons learned in solitude and emerges with a new sense of purpose, clarity, and authenticity. The ego, which has long been the driving force behind our actions and desires, begins to loosen its grip. We no longer feel compelled to live up to external standards or to project a particular image to the world. Instead, we begin to act from a place of inner truth, guided by the wisdom that has emerged from our solitude. Jung believed that the realization of the self was a spiritual process as much as a psychological one. In solitude, we not only confront the shadow but also reconnect with the deeper, divine aspects of our being. The self is not just an individual entity, but a living connection to the archetypal forces that shape the universe. In solitude, we experience a sense of unity with these forces, a profound recognition that we are not separate from the world, but an integral part of it. This sense of unity is not always immediate. The initial stages of solitude may feel fragmented, chaotic, and disorienting as we come face to face with the aspects of ourselves that we have long avoided. But over time, as the layers of the psyche are integrated and the false self is shed, a sense of peace emerges. This peace is not a passive state of inaction, but a deep, abiding inner knowing. The understanding that we are enough as we are, that our worth is not determined by the roles we play or the masks we wear, but by the simple fact of our being. The rebirth that occurs in solitude is also one of liberation. As we embrace our true selves, we are freed from the chains of external validation. No longer do we seek approval from others or measure our worth by the standards of society. Instead, we learn to trust ourselves, to listen to the wisdom of our inner voice, and to act from a place of authentic power. This liberation is not about rejecting the world or retreating from it, but about returning to it from a place of wholeness, self-awareness, and strength. We no longer need to prove ourselves to others, because we have already proven our worth to ourselves. In this way, solitude becomes not an escape, but a return. a return to the source of our being, a return to the essence of who we truly are. It is a process of self-discovery, self-acceptance, and self-expression. It is a journey of shedding the false identities that we have constructed in order to fit into the world and embracing the truth of our soul's longing. The rebirth that comes through solitude is also a spiritual awakening. It is an awakening to the realization that we are not merely isolated individuals, but expressions of a greater whole, interconnected with the fabric of existence. In this awareness, we find peace, purpose, and fulfillment. We no longer feel lost or disconnected, for we understand that we are part of a larger, sacred flow. In conclusion, solitude is not something to be feared or avoided. It is the space in which the self is reborn, where we confront the darkness within and emerge into the light of our true nature. It is a process of purification, integration, and transformation. Through solitude, we find not only ourselves, but the deeper connection to the world, to others, and to the divine. This rebirth, though painful at times, is ultimately a journey of freedom. The freedom to be who we truly are, without the constraints of society, without the masks of the false self. And in this freedom, we discover the sacredness of our own existence, the profound beauty of our being, and the boundless potential that lies within us.